Have you ever faced a moment where every fiber of your being screamed, "I can't do this"? Where fear and anxiety threatened to paralyze you, making you question every step forward? You're not alone. This is a tale as old as time, a universal experience that even the greatest minds in history have struggled with. Join us in this video as we dive deeper into Lysander's journey. Unpack the lessons of Stoicism that helped him overcome his fears, and learn how we, too, can silence the voice that says, "I can't do this." Because sometimes the only thing standing between us and our greatest potential is the story we choose to tell ourselves. I can't do this. In the heart of ancient Athens lived a young scholar named Lysander. From an early age, he was known for his curiosity and passion for knowledge. He devoured texts on philosophy, politics, and rhetoric, and spent countless hours debating with friends and teachers. However, despite his growing intellect, there was one internal obstacle Lysander struggled with, a constant and gnawing self-doubt. One day, an opportunity arose for Lysander to speak at the annual assembly in the city's Grand Forum. It was an event attended by the most influential minds of Athens. In preparation, Lysander spent weeks perfecting his speech on the philosophy of Stoicism, which had deeply influenced his life. As the day approached, however, he began to feel the overwhelming weight of pressure. The fear of failure began to creep into his mind, making him question every word he had written, every argument he planned to present. The night before the assembly, as Lysander stood at the balcony of his modest home, staring at the flickering lights of the city, his mind raced. He paced back and forth, his anxiety growing with each passing minute. "I can't do this," he whispered to himself. His heart raced, and his palms were slick with sweat. The very thought of standing in front of hundreds of people, many of whom were far more experienced than him, sent shivers down his spine. The phrase, "I can't do this," repeated itself in his mind like a relentless echo, each repetition tightening the grip of fear around his chest. His self-doubt convinced him that he would stumble over his words, that he wasn't worthy of standing alongside the great philosophers of the time. He imagined the crowd laughing at his missteps, his arguments dismissed as the ramblings of an inexperienced youth. Just as Lysander was about to abandon his plan entirely, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was his teacher, Thales, an old Stoic philosopher who had guided Lysander through many intellectual and emotional struggles. Thales had a way of seeing into the depths of Lysander's mind, often knowing what troubled him before Lysander spoke a word. "What troubles you, Lysander?" Thales asked, his tone calm but probing. Without hesitation, Lysander poured out his fears. "I'm not ready, Thales. The assembly is full of men who have spent their entire lives honing their arguments. I've read the texts, but I fear my mind will fail me when I'm up there. I can't do this." Thales nodded knowingly. "You speak as though you are defeated before the battle has even begun. Tell me, what is it that truly frightens you? Is it the assembly itself, or is it the story you are telling yourself about it?" Lysander paused, unsure how to respond. Thales, sensing his student's confusion, continued, "Remember what Epictetus teaches us. It is not the things themselves that disturb people, but the judgments they form about them. The assembly is not an enemy to be feared. It is simply a place, filled with people just like you. Your fear stems not from the event, but from your judgment of it." The words of Epictetus resonated with Lysander, but he still struggled to shake his fear. "But what if I fail? What if my words don't come out the way I want them to? What if I'm laughed at?" Thales smiled softly. "Failure is a possibility in all things, but failure is not a reflection of your worth, only of your effort in that moment. And even in failure, there is value. Consider Socrates. Did he fear speaking his truth because he might be mocked? He embraced the process, knowing that the outcome was beyond his control. All you can do, Lysander, is to prepare your mind for the task at hand and let go of the outcome. Focus on what is within your power, your effort, your clarity of thought, and your courage. The rest is not yours to control. Lysander sat with Thales' words for a long moment, allowing them to sink in. His teacher was right. He had been obsessing over an outcome he could not control, instead of focusing on what he could. He had spent so much time worrying about failure that he had forgotten to remind himself of his own capabilities. He had forgotten to focus on the present moment. That night, instead of staying up, Lysander went to bed early. He practiced what he had learned from the Stoics. He reminded himself that tomorrow was just another day, that the assembly was just another event, and that the most important thing he could do was show up, do his best, and let the rest unfold naturally. The next morning, as Lysander stood in the grand forum, he could feel the weight of his earlier fears lifting. The crowd was as large and intimidating as he had imagined, but he focused not on the size of the audience or the grandeur of the occasion, but on the simplicity of his task. He reminded himself of Marcus Aurelius's teachings. Do every act of your life as though it were the last act of your life. This was his moment, and all he needed to do was live in it fully. When it was Lysander's turn to speak, he stepped forward with steady steps. His voice was clear, his thoughts organized. The words flowed from him, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he was present. He spoke about the Stoic idea of control, how much of life is beyond our influence, and how we must focus only on what is within our power. As he spoke, he realized he was living the very philosophy he was teaching. He wasn't concerned about the approval of the crowd, nor was he worried about stumbling over his words. He was simply doing his best, moment by moment. When Lysander finished his speech, there was a pause. Then, slowly, applause filled the air. The audience's reaction, which he had feared so much the night before, now seemed irrelevant. The applause didn't matter as much as the fact that he had overcome his own internal battle. He had faced his fear, stood in the face of uncertainty, and proved to himself that the limits he had once believed in were illusions. After the assembly, as Lysander walked back through the streets of Athens, he felt lighter. Thales met him at the steps of his home, a knowing smile on his face. "You see," Thales said, "the words, 'I can't do this,' were never true. They were just the story you were telling yourself." Lysander nodded, understanding the lesson now in a way he hadn't before. The phrase, "I can't do this," had been a product of his fear, not a reflection of his abilities. He had let his fear of failure cloud his judgment, but now he realized that his mind was his greatest ally when he allowed it to be. From that day forward, Lysander never again uttered the words, "I can't do this." He had learned that intelligence wasn't just about knowing facts or mastering rhetoric. It was about mastering the mind, about recognizing when fear and doubt were clouding judgment, and about focusing on what was within his control. He had learned that the most powerful tool he possessed was his own perspective, and that by changing the way he viewed the world, he could change his experience of it. Years later, Lysander became a respected philosopher in his own right. He often reflected on that night before the assembly, remembering how close he had come to letting fear stop him from pursuing his path. When his students expressed doubts or fears about their own abilities, he would remind them of the words of Epictetus, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And he would tell them the story of how, once upon a time, he too had believed he couldn't do something, until he realized that the only thing standing in his way was his own mind. 2. That's impossible. In the bustling city of Corinth, there lived a man named Cassius, a blacksmith renowned for his craftsmanship. He had created some of the finest weapons in the Roman Empire, and his forge was always ablaze with the sparks of his work. His hands were rough and scarred from years of labor, but he took immense pride in his creations. Each sword, spear, and shield that left his shop was a masterpiece, forged with the precision of a man who understood the importance of detail and discipline. One day, a soldier appeared at Cassius's forge, carrying a strange piece of metal, one that shimmered with an otherworldly sheen. The soldier handed it to Cassius and said, "The Emperor has requested that you forge a sword from this metal. It is a gift from a distant land, and no one else has been able to shape it." Cassius examined the metal with a frown. It was unlike anything he had ever worked with, both heavier and more brittle than the iron he was used to. Cassius's apprentices gathered around him, watching intently. They too could see the difficulty in the task. One of them, a boy named Titus, spoke up. "Master, this metal, it can't be worked. It's impossible to forge a sword from this." Cassius remained silent, his eyes fixed on the metal in his hand. He could feel the doubt creeping into his mind. Was this truly an impossible task? Could even he, with all his years of experience, shape something so unyielding? He looked at the metal again, feeling the weight of expectation from the soldier and the emperor himself. For a moment, the words, "That's impossible," lingered on the tip of his tongue. But then he remembered the teachings of the Stoics that had guided him through many challenges in his life. He recalled the words of Seneca, "Difficulties strengthen the mind, as labor does the body." He realized that his initial reaction, that sense of impossibility, was merely a reflection of his unfamiliarity with the material, not a true statement of fact. The metal was not impossible to work with. It was simply an unknown challenge. Cassius turned to his apprentices and said, "There is no such thing as impossible. Only tasks we have not yet learned how to complete." He saw the skepticism in their eyes, but he knew that this was as much a lesson for them as it was for him. Cassius understood that intelligence was not simply about knowing what could be done. It was about the willingness to explore, experiment, and push the boundaries of what others believed was possible. Determined to prove that there was no such thing as an impossible task, Cassius spent the next several days experimenting with the metal. He worked late into the night, trying different combinations of heat and pressure, using every technique he had learned over the years. At times, the metal seemed to resist all his efforts, breaking or warping under the intense heat. His apprentices began to doubt whether their master could succeed, and Titus once again expressed his concern. "Master, perhaps this really is impossible. No other blacksmith has been able to do it. Maybe we should return the metal and tell the emperor that even you couldn't shape it." But Cassius, with his Stoic mindset, refused to give in to doubt. What others have failed to do has no bearing on what we are capable of. We must focus on what is within our control, the effort we put into our work. The outcome will be what it will be, but we will never know if we surrender too soon. He knew that the idea of impossibility was a trap, one that prevented people from reaching their true potential. Cassius had seen too many craftsmen give up on projects simply because they were too afraid to fail. The Stoic philosophy had taught Cassius that failure was not something to be feared. Failure was simply a teacher, an opportunity to learn and grow. Each time the metal resisted his efforts, he learned something new about its properties. He adjusted his techniques, refining his approach with each attempt. His mind remained focused on the task at hand, free from the distractions of doubt or worry about the outcome. One evening, after many long days of work, Cassius finally discovered a way to temper the metal. It required an unusual combination of cooling methods and a precise balance of heat. The process was delicate, but it worked. The metal, which had once seemed unyielding, began to take shape under his skilled hands. Slowly, he forged it into a sword, one that gleamed with a brilliance unlike any weapon he had ever made. When the sword was finished, it was a masterpiece. The blade was sharper and stronger than any other Cassius had crafted. The soldier returned to the forge to collect the sword and was astonished by what he saw. "I didn't think it was possible," he said, marveling at the weapon. "No one else could have done this." Cassius smiled but remained humble. "There is no such thing as impossible, only things that have not yet been tried enough times." He understood that the real lesson was not in the success of the sword, but in the persistence that had brought it into being. Intelligence, he knew, was not about knowing all the answers from the start. It was about being willing to explore the unknown, to push past the boundaries of what others believed was possible, and to keep trying until the solution revealed itself. The story of Cassius's impossible sword spread throughout Corinth, and many came to see the blade for themselves. Some believed it was enchanted, while others thought Cassius had discovered a secret technique that no other blacksmith knew. But those who truly understood the Stoic philosophy realized that the magic wasn't in the sword, it was in the mindset of the man who had forged it. Years later, Cassius would often reflect on that experience when facing other challenges in his life. Each time he encountered a difficult task, he would remind himself that nothing was truly impossible. He would approach each new challenge with the same patience, discipline, and perseverance that had served him in the forge. And he would teach his apprentices the same lesson. When you think something is impossible, remember that it is only impossible in your mind. With the right effort, anything can be achieved. Cassius's story became a symbol of Stoic resilience, a reminder that the limits we place on ourselves are often illusions. In truth, the only thing that is truly impossible is what we believe to be so. The blacksmith's refusal to accept defeat, his relentless pursuit of mastery, and his ability to see every failure as a step towards success were the marks of true intelligence. For the rest of his life, Cassius never allowed the words, "That's impossible," to enter his mind. He knew that such words were a barrier, a trap that kept people from realizing their full potential. Instead, he embraced the challenges before him with a calm and steady resolve, knowing that the only true limit was the one he set for himself. 3. I already know that. In the city of Alexandria, famous for its vast libraries and bustling intellectual life, there lived a scholar named Marcus. He was known far and wide for his extensive knowledge, especially in the fields of astronomy and philosophy. His reputation as an expert in these subjects made him a sought-after teacher and mentor. Many young students flocked to his home, eager to learn from his wisdom. His confidence in his knowledge, however, often veered into arrogance. Whenever someone brought up a subject he was familiar with, his automatic response was, "I already know that." One day, a young philosopher named Tiberius, who had recently returned from studying with the Stoics in Rome, came to Alexandria to meet Marcus. Tiberius had heard much about Marcus and respected his work deeply. The young philosopher approached Marcus with the hope of learning from him, but also sharing some of the new ideas he had encountered during his time in Rome. When Tiberius first met Marcus, he found the elder scholar to be a man of sharp intellect and commanding presence. Marcus immediately launched into a lecture about the stars, explaining in great detail the movements of the planets and their influence on the seasons. Tiberius listened respectfully but soon realized that much of what Marcus was saying was based on outdated theories. During his time in Rome, Tiberius had learned of new advancements in the understanding of planetary movements, and he wanted to share these insights with Marcus. When there was finally a pause in Marcus's monologue, Tiberius spoke up gently. "Master Marcus, I have recently returned from Rome, where the Stoics have been discussing new theories about the motion of the planets. I think you might find these ideas intriguing and perhaps useful for your own research." Marcus barely glanced at Tiberius before responding, "I already know that. The movements of the planets have been studied for centuries, and I've spent my entire life understanding their patterns. There is nothing new to be discovered there." He waved his hand dismissively, signaling the end of the conversation. Tiberius felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped to engage in a meaningful exchange of ideas, to learn from Marcus's experience while sharing his own discoveries. Instead, he found himself silenced by the older scholar's arrogance. Despite this, Tiberius respected Marcus too much to challenge him directly, so he simply nodded and kept his thoughts to himself. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was missing an opportunity to grow. Weeks passed, and Tiberius continued his studies in Alexandria, often crossing paths with Marcus. Each time they spoke, Marcus would dominate the conversation with his extensive knowledge, never once asking Tiberius about his own experiences or ideas. The phrase, "I already know that," became a familiar refrain in their interactions, and Tiberius began to realize that Marcus had stopped learning long ago, not because he lacked opportunities, but because he believed he had nothing left to learn. One afternoon, Tiberius found himself in the library, poring over a newly arrived scroll from Rome. It detailed the latest observations from a renowned Stoic astronomer, outlining revolutionary findings about the orbits of the planets. Tiberius was fascinated by the information and immediately thought of Marcus. Despite their previous interactions, he decided to share the scroll with him, hoping that Marcus might be more open to new ideas this time. When Tiberius approached Marcus with the scroll, the older scholar glanced at it briefly before dismissing it with a familiar phrase. "I already know that," Marcus said, without even reading a word. "These new theories are often nothing more than speculation. I trust the wisdom of the ancients, not the fanciful ideas of these so-called modern thinkers." Tiberius felt his patience wearing thin. He had heard this same response from Marcus over and over again, and he realized that Marcus's refusal to engage with new information was not just a matter of preference, it was a deep-seated belief that he had already reached the pinnacle of knowledge. Marcus had built a wall around himself, fortified by the words, "I already know that." And this wall was preventing him from growing, learning, and adapting to the evolving world around him. Tiberius decided to take a different approach. "Master Marcus," he said carefully, "what if the greatest wisdom lies not in what we know, but in recognizing how much we still don't know? The Stoics teach us that wisdom is not a destination, but a journey. If we ever believe we have reached the end of that journey, we close ourselves off to the endless possibilities of discovery." Marcus frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion that he might still have something to learn. "Are you suggesting that my knowledge is incomplete?" he asked, his tone sharp. Tiberius shook his head gently. "No, Master Marcus. I am suggesting that no one's knowledge is ever complete. Even the wisest among us have blind spots. Socrates himself said, 'I know that I know nothing.' It is this humble recognition of our ignorance that allows us to continue learning, to remain open to new ideas and perspectives. When we say, 'I already know that,' we shut the door on growth." For the first time, Marcus didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be considering Tiberius's words, though his pride was clearly wrestling with the idea. Tiberius pressed on, sensing an opportunity. Think of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who taught that we must be willing to question our assumptions and challenge our own beliefs. If we cling too tightly to what we think we know, we risk becoming stagnant, stuck in old patterns while the world moves forward without us. Marcus looked at Tiberius for a long moment before finally speaking. "You speak wisely for one so young," he said, though there was a hint of reluctance in his voice. Perhaps there is something to what you say, but tell me, Why should I listen to the musings of these new thinkers when the ancients have already given us all the answers? Tiberius smiled, sensing that Marcus was finally opening up to the possibility of learning something new. Because knowledge is not static. The world changes, and so too must our understanding of it. The ancients were wise, but they were also limited by the tools and knowledge of their time. We have the benefit of standing on their shoulders, of building on their discoveries. But if we refuse to look beyond what they taught us, we will miss the chance to see further. Marcus remained silent for a moment, then slowly reached out and took the scroll from Tiberius's hands. He unrolled it and began to read, his eyes scanning the text with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. As he read, Tiberius could see the gears turning in the older scholar's mind, the walls of certainty beginning to crack. After a long silence, Marcus looked up from the scroll, his expression thoughtful. "It seems," he said slowly, "that there is more to learn than I had thought." There was no admission of defeat in his voice, but there was a hint of humility, a recognition that perhaps he had been too quick to dismiss the new ideas that had come his way. From that day forward, Marcus's attitude began to shift. Though he still held on to much of his old knowledge, he became more willing to listen, to engage with new ideas, and to question his own assumptions. The phrase, "I already know that," no longer escaped his lips so easily. Instead, he began to approach each new piece of information with curiosity rather than dismissal, understanding that true intelligence lies not in the accumulation of facts, but in the recognition of how much we still have to learn. Tiberius, for his part, continued to study under Marcus, grateful for the opportunity to share in the older scholar's wisdom, while also contributing his own insights. Together, they explored new ideas, challenging each other and growing in their understanding of the world. In the end, Marcus learned that the greatest enemy of wisdom is not ignorance, but the belief that we already possess all the answers. Four. It's not my fault. In the heart of ancient Athens, there was a man named Darius, a respected trader who dealt in fine silks and rare spices. His wealth and influence had grown considerably over the years, and he had become known for his ability to negotiate deals with merchants from far-flung lands. Despite his success, Darius harbored a deep resentment toward many of his competitors and often found himself entangled in disputes over lost goods, delayed shipments, and broken contracts. Whenever things went wrong, his immediate reaction was always the same: "It's not my fault." One spring, Darius embarked on a massive trade expedition, hiring a fleet of ships to transport his goods across the Aegean Sea to Asia Minor. He had invested heavily in this venture, pouring much of his wealth into the cargo, confident that the profits would be immense. However, disaster struck when a violent storm hit the fleet, sinking half of the ships and destroying a large portion of the merchandise. When news of the disaster reached Athens, Darius was furious. He stormed into the port authority's office, demanding compensation for his losses and blaming the ship captains for their failure to navigate safely through the storm. "It's not my fault," Darius yelled at the officials. "I hired experienced captains, and it was their responsibility to protect my goods. How could they have let this happen? They should have been better prepared." The port official, an elderly man with a calm demeanor, listened patiently to Darius's outburst before responding. "The storm was beyond anyone's control, Darius. No one could have predicted such a violent turn in the weather. The captains did what they could, but the sea is unpredictable." Darius refused to accept this explanation. "It's not my fault," he repeated. "I've lost everything because of their incompetence. Someone must pay for this." The official sighed and offered his condolences, but reminded Darius that the sea was always a risk in trade, and that as a seasoned merchant, Darius should have known this. However, Darius was too consumed with anger and blame to listen. He returned home, brooding over his losses, convinced that he had been wronged and that the fault lay entirely with others. In the days that followed, Darius's business began to falter. With much of his merchandise lost at sea, he struggled to fulfill his contracts. Customers who had once relied on him began to take their business elsewhere, turning to his competitors for the goods they needed. Darius, however, refused to take responsibility for his situation. Instead, he blamed the captains, the weather, and even his customers for being disloyal. "It's not my fault," he told anyone who would listen. "I've been treated unfairly." As his frustration grew, Darius's once thriving business began to collapse. His refusal to acknowledge his own role in the disaster blinded him to the actions he could have taken to salvage his remaining assets. Instead of cutting his losses and adapting to the new circumstances, he continued to point fingers and make excuses, all the while watching his fortune slip away. One day, as he sat in the marketplace watching other merchants conduct their business, Darius was approached by an old acquaintance, a philosopher named Callimachus. The two had once been close, but their paths had diverged as Darius had pursued wealth while Callimachus had devoted himself to the study of Stoicism. Seeing the troubled look on Darius's face, Callimachus sat beside him and asked, "What weighs so heavily on your mind, my friend?" Darius, never one to shy away from sharing his grievances, launched into a tirade about the storm, the captains, and his customers, all of whom he blamed for his current predicament. "It's not my fault," he said again, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I did everything right, but the gods, the sea, and these people have conspired against me." Callimachus listened intently, and when Darius had finished, he remained silent for a moment, considering his words. Finally, he spoke. "Darius, I understand your frustration, but you are mistaken if you believe that placing blame on others will ease your burden or change your circumstances. The Stoics teach us that we must take responsibility for our lives, regardless of what happens to us. This includes accepting the things we cannot control and focusing on what we can." Darius frowned, unwilling to admit any fault. "But how can I be responsible for a storm or for the actions of others? These events were out of my hands." Callimachus nodded. "Indeed, the storm was beyond your control, just as the actions of others are often outside your influence. But what is within your control, Darius, is how you respond to these events. You cannot change the fact that the storm happened, but you can choose how you move forward from here. By clinging to blame and resentment, you are only harming yourself. Blaming others prevents you from seeing the opportunities that still lie before you." Darius remained skeptical. "So what are you saying? That I should just accept the losses and move on?" Callimachus smiled gently. "Yes, but more than that, you must learn to take responsibility for your own actions, even when things go wrong. You chose to invest in this venture, knowing the risks. The sea is always unpredictable, and every merchant knows that. You could have diversified your investments or taken precautions to mitigate your losses. By saying it's not my fault, you are denying your own agency in this situation. You are refusing to learn from your mistakes." These words struck a chord with Darius, though he was reluctant to admit it. He had spent so long blaming others that he had not considered his own role in the disaster. Could it be that his refusal to take responsibility was the very thing holding him back? Callimachus continued, "The Stoics teach us to accept responsibility not as a burden, but as a source of power. When we acknowledge our role in events, we reclaim control over our lives. Blaming others only makes us powerless, for it suggests that we are at the mercy of forces beyond our control. But when we say, "This is my responsibility," we become capable of making changes, of learning from our failures, and of growing stronger. Darius sat in silence, turning these ideas over in his mind. He realized that Callimachus was right. His constant refrain of "it's not my fault" had done nothing to improve his situation. In fact, it had only deepened his misery and driven away those who might have helped him recover. By refusing to take responsibility, he had allowed himself to become a victim of circumstance, rather than the master of his own fate. In the weeks that followed, Darius began to shift his perspective. He stopped blaming others for his misfortunes and started taking ownership of his decisions. He re-evaluated his business strategies, learning from the mistakes he had made. Instead of resenting his competitors, he sought to learn from them, adopting new techniques and diversifying his trade routes to minimize future risks. Slowly but surely, his business began to recover. As Darius embraced this new mindset, he found that his interactions with others improved as well. No longer weighed down by blame and bitterness, he was able to approach his customers and fellow merchants with a sense of humility and responsibility. His reputation, which had suffered during his period of anger and blame, began to improve once again. People respected him not just for his trading skills, but for his newfound wisdom and accountability. Years later, Darius would look back on that storm and the losses it caused with a sense of gratitude. It had been a painful lesson, but it had also been the turning point in his life. By letting go of the need to blame others, he had discovered the power of personal responsibility and had grown stronger as a result. He often thought of Callimachus's words and the Stoic philosophy that had guided him through those difficult times. In the end, Darius learned that saying, "It's not my fault," was not only a denial of responsibility, but also a denial of the opportunity to grow. By taking responsibility for his actions, even in the face of forces beyond his control, he had reclaimed his power and found the strength to rebuild his life. He had learned that true intelligence lies not in avoiding blame, but in embracing accountability as a path to wisdom and growth. As we conclude this story, we find profound lessons on overcoming the limits we set for ourselves, lessons that resonate deeply with Stoic philosophy and can guide us in our own lives. Both characters confront obstacles that seem insurmountable, yet they each realize that their greatest battle is not with the external world, but within their own minds. Lysander's journey is a powerful reminder of how fear and self-doubt can cloud our judgment and paralyze us from taking action. When faced with the opportunity to speak at the Grand Forum, he initially allows his fears to overwhelm him. The words, "I can't do this," repeat like a mantra in his mind, convincing him that he is not worthy or prepared. However, through the wisdom of his teacher Thales, he learns to shift his perspective. Thales challenges him to see that his fear is not rooted in the reality of the situation, but in his judgment of it. This is a fundamental Stoic principle. It's not the events themselves that disturb us, but our perception of them. Enter Tiberius, a young philosopher who understood that true wisdom isn't about how much we know, but about recognizing the vastness of what we don't know. His persistence and humility challenged Marcus to break free from his intellectual complacency. Tiberius's reminder that knowledge is a journey, not a destination, slowly cracked the walls Marcus had built around himself. The turning point came when Marcus, albeit reluctantly, decided to listen and read the new theories Tiberius brought forward. This marked the beginning of a transformation in Marcus's perspective, showing that even the most knowledgeable among us must remain open to learning. As he started to embrace curiosity over certainty, Marcus's growth resumed, and his wisdom deepened. The story of Marcus and Tiberius reminds us that the greatest enemy of wisdom is not ignorance, but the belief that we already possess all the answers. It is a call to remain humble, to keep questioning, and to stay open to the boundless possibilities of learning. Thank you